Okay, there, it went ding. Okay, right. We've talked about Acari. That's the group with mites and ticks, which is itself a member of the Arachnida, which is in turn a member of the chelicerates, which is one of the big arthropod groups. The second arthropod group that I want to talk about is the Crustacea. This one's very familiar, especially the marine crustaceans, many of which are delicious and commercially valuable. Lobsters, crabs, and marine shrimp, for example, are targets of billion-dollar fisheries. There's plenty of freshwater crustaceans around. Coming from South Louisiana, I've got to rep crawfish, good old Procambarus clarki, which are absolutely tasty. There are, of course, lots of freshwater and marine crustaceans that we don't eat, but they're ecologically very important, like copepods. There's a lot of free-living copepods that are important links in food webs in both the open ocean and in freshwater ecosystems. And things like euphausiids, otherwise known as krill, big food for whales, especially in Arctic waters. And there's also some parasites. There's something on the order of 35,000 crustacean species. It's a very large group, a very diverse one. You've even got one group of crustaceans that has land-dwelling members. You've all seen roly-polies or pillbugs or whatever you grew up calling them. They are members of a crustacean subgroup called the isopods. And then there's 5 major groups of parasitic crustaceans, only one of which sometimes infects humans. And it's not one you're that likely to see around here, but it can infect humans and domestic animals. Most of the others are primarily parasitic in the oceans, and they can have an impact on farmed fish, for example. They can have an impact on the salmon industry, which again is a pretty big industry these days. Okay, there's not 35, there's about 55,000 members in all. It's the most diverse arthropod group in the oceans. There's 3 distinct groupings of segments: tagmata, the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. In a lot of cases, certainly in the subgroup Malacostraca, which is the one that's got all the edible ones, the head and the thorax are fused together into a unit called the cephalothorax. If you've ever eaten a boiled crawfish, the abdomen is the tail. That's the part that you pull off and peel and eat. And, in a shrimp, it's the same. The muscle of the abdomen is the edible part of the shrimp. The so-called head of the crawfish is actually the head plus the thorax, and collectively we'd call that the cephalothorax. That's the part that has all of the walking legs and, of course, mouth parts and antennae on it as well. There's also a terminal, not really a segment, called the telson in a crawfish or a lobster. That is the middle part of the tail. The last appendages plus the telson make up that paddle-like tail that crawfish use to shoot backwards and flip. Right, the appendages have 2 branches each. They are biramous. We saw this earlier, that on the walking legs, there's a gill branch that goes up under the carapace in a specialized gill chamber, and then the walking branch that the critter walks on. And the head's always got 5 pairs of appendages. There's 2 pairs of antennae and 3 pairs of mouth parts. Incidentally, I don't know, I've had some students that have been surprised to know this. If you look at a crab, crabs are crustaceans, and they're malacostracans, which means they're in the same group as shrimp and lobsters and things like that. It's just that in crabs, that cephalothorax has gotten very large. No, that's what you see when you look down on a crab. You're looking at this cephalothorax, which has gotten big and usually gotten very wide. And the abdomen is kept tucked up under the body. The crab does not normally let its abdomen go out flapping in the breeze. It tucks it up pretty tightly into a groove on the underside of the cephalothorax. So crabs do have abdomens. You're just not going to see them unless you deliberately go looking for it. Next time you mess around with a crab, you can go look for its abdomen. Typical early crustaceans, or typical crustaceans, begin life as a larva called a nauplius. This is going to be important in a bit. That's a nauplius. I don't know what species it comes from, and it hardly matters. You can see larvae like this in fresh water. I usually see them when I just look at plain old pond water. Typical marine crustaceans begin life as a nauplius. Brine shrimp begin as a nauplius. Have this sort of oval body. You can't really see it clearly here, but the head is on the left-hand side, and right in the center of the, I guess, forehead, there's an eye that normally looks red. It's a little bit out of focus here. And then there's 3 pairs of appendages in a nauplius, the first and second antennae and the first set of mouth parts. But in the nauplius, they're all used for swimming. As the nauplius molts, it'll typically add segments, maybe 1 per molt, and it will increase its number of appendages, and the appendages will shift into their final form. But this is a pretty typical early crustacean larva, and it's something we'll actually come back to in a bit. So you need to know the nauplius. We don't have time to go over all of the free-living groups of crustaceans. I've mentioned a group called the Malacostraca. That includes the ones that you eat, but there aren't any parasitic malacostracans that I've been able to discover. The 5 major parasitic crustacean groups include copepods, which have a lot of free-living members, but also a number of parasites. A very strange, highly modified group called the pentastomids, aka the tongue worms, because they've got these wormy bodies with very highly reduced appendages. It's not immediately obvious that they are crustaceans at all. A group that we see a fair amount in freshwater, the Branchiura, aka fish lice. You can find these in Arkansas. We didn't spot any of them in our fish necropsy, but they do turn up. And if any of you know the Adamses, they've actually done some research projects on fish lice populations in some of our local fish populations. So Branchiura you might actually encounter. Isopoda includes the ones you'd know would be roly-polies. There's lots of marine isopods, and there's a number of parasitic isopods. And then finally, a group called the Cirripedia, that's the barnacles. Very highly modified anatomy as adults. It's not immediately obvious that they're even arthropods. For a while, they were classified with the mollusks because many of them have a very thick calcium carbonate shell surrounding them as adults. But in fact, they are crustaceans, and many of them are free-living. But there are some parasitic barnacles, one of which I actually wrote a scientific paper on and published it back in 1994 with this really cool guy named Doug Long, who was a master at fish biology and also at going out and getting drunk with every major musical touring act that came through the San Francisco Bay Area. But that's another story. Right, here's a typical copepod, and this is a freshwater one. This is one you could spot today if you dredged up some water out of Lake Conway. They're extremely abundant in aquatic habitats. This particular one's called Cyclops. The head is on the right, and that dark spot you see in the center of the head is an eye. They've only got one central eye. The brown stuff in the midline is the gut. And this is a female because she's carrying egg sacs around. That's 2 sacs of eggs that she's got on either side of her tail. And critters like this are important in food webs. They get eaten by small fish and such. There's others that are marine. Calanus is sometimes said to be the most abundant animal genus on Earth because in productive ocean waters, there may be millions of these guys per cubic meter. And they feed heavily on planktonic algae and in turn get fed upon by small fish and really anything that can fit them into their mouths. So they're absolutely critical in marine food webs, especially out in the blue water, away from shore. But there are always those that have turned to the dark side of the force. And here's Lepiopterus salmonis, one of these parasitic copepods. They've evolved independently several times. There's no single clade of parasitic copepods, and they make up 1/3 of all known copepod species. I believe there are some you could find in freshwater, although we didn't. I don't know how common those would be around here. But collectively, they parasitize every known phylum in the marine biosphere, and they're the most diverse parasitic group that goes after marine fish. This one in particular is a threat to the farm salmon industry, which is a $12 billion industry. This one's the salmon fish louse. And I think you've got a male and a female. The female is the one that has that red streak in the body, that's blood. And the long brownish things that look like a kind of forked tail, those are egg strands. You know, just like this copepod has those egg sacs, make those a heck of a lot longer, and you end up with something like this. They've got a flattened body. It's flattened for easy attachment to the skin or the gills, and then the piercing mouth parts suck blood. And in addition to weakening the fish, you know, any wound on a fish, or for that matter, on any living thing, can be the portal for secondary bacterial infections. So that's why you really don't want these things on your salmon. There's the life cycle. Adult male and female are on the left at about your 9 o'clock. The eggs hatch into planktonic nauplius larvae, or nauplii is the plural. Those drift until they molt into a free-swimming stage called a copepodid, because it looks like a free-living copepod. That's at about your 1 o'clock. Those have to find a host, and if they find one, they'll latch on, molt into a larval stage called a chalimus, molt a couple of times, and eventually reach adult form. They're ectoparasitic, and although they'll normally stay on a host, they can swim from one fish to another. So they can spread like that. And like an awful lot of diseases, they get bad when you crowd their hosts in together, right? Just like crowding a lot of toddlers into a daycare results in massive outbreaks of runny noses and creeping crud. Salmon lice spread very easily in the crowded conditions of a farm salmon pen. You can see there's pretty crowded right there. There are pesticides that will treat it, but we've started seeing there's that natural selection thing, gets you every time. Yeah, it's almost as if that Darwin guy was onto something there. We've been seeing more and more resistant salmon lice. Amazing how that works out, ain't it? There's other copepods that get so highly modified anatomically, you can hardly tell they're arthropods when they're mature. Lerniacera brachialis, you can see it's got, over at about your 2 o'clock, it's got a pretty typical nauplius stage right there. Temporarily latches onto a bottom-dwelling fish, like a flounder, goes through a couple of molts, and then buries its head in the flesh of a cod and loses most of the outward signs that it is even an arthropod at all. The part that's buried inside grows these weird root-like extensions that hold it into the flesh and probably absorb nutrition. Part of the body just kind of sticks out like a sack, and then they develop these egg strands that are left waving out in the breeze. So yeah, the thing almost looks like a plant with the head turning into this root system, and the rest of the body hangs out, and then the egg strands are, of course, constantly releasing eggs which hatch into larvae, etc. This is one that parasitizes Antarctic whales, Penella balanopterae. Parasites like this are partly internal and partly external, and sometimes those are called mesoparasites, between ectoparasites on the outside and endoparasites, which are completely internal. You have mesoparasites, and this one can reach 30 centimeters long. You can't really see the roots, but at the one at the top, you can see that long worm-like body, and then the egg strands are the thing that's hanging down almost vertically. Fortunately, none of them get people, as far as I am aware. But people do sometimes find themselves parasitized by members of the second group I want to talk about, pentastomids. No, that's not an a cappella singing group. Pentastomids are very weird crustaceans that have lost a lot of the typical crustacean features, including almost all of their appendages. They bear 4 very stubby and highly reduced appendages, plus a mouth at one end of the body. The appendages were actually once taken to be mouths, which is what pentastomid looks like, 5 mouth. Pentastomid means 5 mouths. And as you can see, this particular one, linguatula, looks, if you're on drugs, a bit like a tongue. So the common name for these is tongue worms, although they're not worms at all. As adults, they parasitize the respiratory tract of reptiles, birds, and sometimes mammals. Humans will sometimes get them by accident. This particular one has just been removed from the nasal passage of a reindeer. So this may be why Rudolph had a red nose. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a case of pentastomids, and if you ever saw it, you would say it's worse than COVID. Okay, I just made that up. All right, sorry. Right. There is one species that can infect dogs and cats, although my contacts in the local veterinary scene have never seen this. So as far as I know, it's not at all common around here. It's the kind of thing you tend to get from eating raw meat. So if your dog and cat is eating kibble or canned food, they're not going to get this. But dogs and cats, and occasionally people, tend to get this by eating raw meat and organ meats in particular. The eggs get sneezed out, or they get defecated out, and they get eaten by herbivorous mammals, rodents or something like that. The juveniles burrow into the walls of the gut, lymph nodes, liver, mesenteries, and form nodules. Over there at the left, that's a cross-section through a nodule. You can see there's an actual body that's surrounded by layers of tissue. And then that's what the nodules look like to the naked eye over there in figure B. When a carnivore eats infected herbivore tissues, they'll transform into adults and make their way to the lungs. Or, I mean, reindeers aren't carnivores, but I would assume they would get them just from eating plant matter that's contaminated with larvae. It's actually an interesting question. I wonder how reindeer do get them. Okay, I just stumped myself. I don't actually know. These haven't been studied a lot because they don't infect humans very much, but you can get them if you eat larvae. The larvae will travel into your organs and form these nodules, and that's what you're seeing here. This unfortunate person, you can see, has a lot of little shadows on his X-ray, and if you zoom in, you can see that each one of these nodules has this slightly radio opaque thing in it that looks a little bit like a letter C. That's the coiled up larva. So if you get these larvae, they end up in your organs, and you've got visceral linguatuliasis. Or if you eat some of these nodules, you can get adults living in your nose and airway, and that's nasopharyngeal linguatuliasis. And that's most common in populations that eat raw meat or raw offal, organ meats. This is actually a related condition that's visceral porocephaliasis, and that's caused by infection with a different species, Porocephalus, or sometimes genus Armilifer. And you get this from having an awful lot of contact with snakes. So I don't know what the heck this person was doing. I'd have to go back and look up the paper. But yeah, eating raw snake meat is not recommended. I'm sure you'll find that easy advice to follow, mostly. Okay, right. Fish lice are so modified for parasitism that it's not clear exactly how they're related to everything else. And these are not copepods. We talked about salmon lice on a previous slide, but just to make things confusing, these fish lice belong to a completely separate crustacean group called the Branchiura. And again, they're heavily modified for parasitism. One pair of mouth parts is modified into a pair of suckers. That's the kind of light-colored circles that you see on either side of the mouth. If this fish louse was a clock face, it's those light-colored circles that you'd see at about your 10 o'clock and your 2 o'clock. The other mouth parts are modified for piercing because fish lice are ectoparasites. They'll clamp right down on the outside of a fish and slurp up blood and bodily fluids. The gut is branched. You can see those gut branches to the left and right of the midline. And the overall body shape is very highly flattened because that makes it harder for them to dislodge. And there you can see a fish louse on a goldfish right there. You can see how they're lying very flat. And they'll parasitize almost every freshwater fish that they can come into contact with. They'll get commercially farmed species. They'll go through fish hatcheries. 1997 outbreak forced the closure of the Scottish rainbow trout fishery. And as always, aside from just weakening the fish itself, they can cause secondary bacterial infections, and their bites can even spread bacterial disease because fish lice can actually leave and come back. They're not permanently stuck, so they can actually go from host to host. Males and females copulate while they're on the host, and then every few days the female will swim down to a substrate and lay some eggs. So there's the adults on a stingray. The female swims down and lays her eggs on a hard substrate. And these hatch into larvae, which swim until they can find a new host. One means of control that's been used is if you've got a pond with a very soft bottom, you can lay a trap for fish louse eggs just by putting boards on the bottom of your pond. They won't lay their eggs on soft, muddy stuff. They'll try to lay them on something firm. So if you put boards on the bottom of the pond, they'll lay eggs on the boards, and then every few days you pull up the boards and let them dry in the sun until the eggs are all dead. That's sometimes helpful in case you ever have to deal with the heartbreak of fish lice. And I encountered some work coming out of South Africa that suggests that certain fish parasites are actually accumulators of heavy metals, which means that they are definitely parasites after my own heart because I tend to accumulate heavy metal as well. Okay, music in my case. In the case of fish lice, their bodies are just good at building up concentrations of whatever metals are in the environment. And the idea is this might actually make them useful in biological monitoring because it's easy to sample them if they're present. You just catch some fish, pull off the fish lice, drop them into whatever analytical equipment you've got, and you can get a measurement on how much heavy metal might be present in the environment. So that's some interesting work that suggests that although, people who care about fish populations don't like them, but there's still some uses that we can put them to. I'll leave you to ponder that when we look at barnacles. These are a type called goose barnacles. It actually did used to be believed that these were baby geese, as in the birds, but they're not. The white things that you're seeing are calcium carbonate plates that surround the actual body. There's several of them, and they fit together into this structure that's got an opening in the middle. And in this picture, you can see appendages, legs, getting stuck out from between these plates. Barnacles start life as your typical nauplius and swim around. They'll molt and transform into a slightly different larval type called a cypress larva. And then when they find a place to settle, they'll glue their heads to it. So the stalk that these barnacles are using to attach to, I think this is driftwood, is or originally was part of the head. The appendages are homologous to the legs. But the appendages are extended out when there's water and sweep the water for food particles and pass them down to the mouth, which is buried deep within those plates. So we know that these are not only arthropods, but crustaceans because they develop from a nauplius larva that's pretty hard to tell from other crustacean nauplius larvae. Well, except for the fact that it's got horns, but never mind that. But that's a case where we were able to learn something about species relationships by looking at larvae instead of looking so much on only the adult. This is the thing that I did a paper on a long time ago. That's an Antarctic dogfish, a small shark, and buried in its head is a couple of Analasma squalicola. There are barnacles that will attach to whales and sharks and not do them any particular harm. But Analasma doesn't just attach to dogfish sharks, it grows into them. And that attachment stalk that we saw in the case of the goose barnacles, right there, that muscular stalk that is what they're using to attach to the wood, that grows into a set of root-like growths, and Analasma absorbs nutrients directly through these root-like growths that are coming out of its head. In the what you're looking at here is the black-looking stuff is equivalent to those calcium carbonate plates that you see here, those white things, but this species doesn't calcify. Just got this tough leathery membrane called, I believe that's the capitulum. The appendages are in the middle, and they're kind of unsightly pink color, and they're actually vestigial. They're not used for much of anything. And then that light colored stuff is all eggs. So these, compensate for any anatomical deficiencies by reproducing like hell, which we've seen in many parasites before. So yeah, that is a very odd parasitic barnacle. Check out my paper on it with Douglas J. Long in the journal Systematic Parasitology back in 1994. Well, you don't have to, but it is out there. The weirdest of all are rhizocephalan barnacles, and we know that they're barnacles because they've got nauplius larvae with horns on them, like regular barnacle nauplius larvae. These, however, attach to a crustacean host. Typically, it's a crab, and they grow into this. The arthropod body is completely gone in the adult. They turn into this network of filaments that grows all through the body of their crab host. That network is called the interna. It's only shown on the left side of this drawing, but it's present on the right as well. They don't only grow on one side or not. It's only shown on this side for clarity. But of course, they absorb nutrition from the crab through this interna, and they bud off this sac-like growth called the externa. And the externa is under the tail. You may not be able to see it clearly here, but this is a crab where the tail has been peeled away from the underside of the abdomen where it's usually kept. And under that tail is this sac-like growth, the externa. If that was not creepy enough for you, the rhizocephalan starts seriously screwing with crab hormones. A crab that's infected won't molt anymore. If it molted, it would get rid of that externa. It would just be shed with the rest of the exoskeleton. So the crab quits molting, and the crab starts guarding the externa because the externa looks like and is in the right place to be the crab's own egg sac. Crabs would normally carry their eggs on the underside of their abdomen, tucked up between the abdomen and the cephalothorax. Well, the externa makes the crab, I hesitate to say think, but the crab treats that externa as if it were its own egg sac. And it will do this even if it's a male, because the rhizocephalan eats the male's gonads. This is a phenomenon known as parasitic castration. And it's not only rhizocephalans. Flukes will do that to their snail host as well. So this will parasitize a male crab, make it think it's a female, give it a false egg sac to take care of, and eat its gonads. Be very glad these do not parasitize people. That would be just Lovecraftian horror. Last group of crustaceans, the isopods. There's lots of marine isopods that are free living. There are some deep sea isopods that get up to a foot long. They look kind of like these roly-polies, but they're a lot bigger. Isopods are the only major crustacean group that's invaded the land. Pillbugs or sowbugs or roly-polies, whatever you call them, those are in the isopods. And there are some that have turned to a life of crime. These are some parasitic isopods on a fish from the Mediterranean, Neurocilla acuminata. One that I came across this on a random YouTube video. You should look this up. Orthione griffensis is native to the Northeast Pacific, the waters of Siberia, northern China, Japan, areas like that. But it's been introduced to the Pacific Northwest, and it's a parasite of a small animal called the mud shrimp, genus Eupagebia. Should have italicized that, but that's Eupagebia. And it grows in their gill chambers. Remember that tucked up under the exoskeleton of the cephalothorax, there's a chamber where the gills are, and it grows in there, sucks blood, seriously weakens the mud shrimp. That's a host mud shrimp up at the top, and then down at the lower center, the female is large, the male is small. This one actually has two separate dimorphic sexes. And yeah, I found this is very cool. This is this kid who goes around the beach in the Pacific Northwest digging up mud shrimp, pulling out these Orthione parasitic isopods, throwing them in his compost pile and letting the shrimp go. And it's so adorable because he names every shrimp. This is the kind of thing my kid would do. Hell, this is the kind of thing I might have done at a much younger age. But I don't know whether that's ultimately going to do much good, because this is now pretty widespread in the Pacific Northwest. Some estuaries, the mud shrimp have been completely wiped out by these introduced parasites. And people who are concerned about such things are worried about means to control it. Not that humans eat Eupagebia mud shrimp, but certainly other things do. They're important for the overall health of the ecosystem. So yeah, I don't know how much good it will do, but I applaud that kid for picking out and throwing away Orthione parasites from his local mud shrimp population. You know, somebody's got to do it. The most horrifying parasitic arthropod is Cymathoa exigua. It enters a fish's mouth through the gills, latches onto the tongue, puts its mouth parts right into the main blood vessel supplying the tongue, and just starts sucking away. The tongue is deprived of its blood supply and wastes away. When this is done, there's only a little stump of a tongue left. But the parasite happens to be the same size and shape as the fish's tongue. And because it's latched onto the stump of the tongue, which still has some muscles in it, the fish can actually move the parasite around like it was its own tongue. So this particular parasite just sits back and replaces the fish's tongue, all the time slurping on the fish's blood. One of the cooler parasite strategies I can think of hearing about. Every so often, this makes the news when somebody buys a whole fish at Whole Paycheck or something like that and is cutting it up for dinner and discovers, oh my God, what the hell is this in the fish's mouth? It's just a parasitic isopod and it doesn't hurt people, although it can't be convenient for the fish. Okay, right. I'm going to bless that and call it dinner. And I will hit the stop recording button, and that will make this thing stop recording. And here we go.